Namaskar, hello and welcome viewers. You're watching the special presentation of Sansad TV, Bills and Insight, your one-stop destination for views, news and analysis of proposed legislations of India that have far-reaching implications and impact your life. I'm your host Kriti Mishra, and today the spotlight is on the new labour laws. From working hours to enhanced salary, several aspects concerning employment and work culture are expected to change with the new labour codes. Before the detailed analysis, let's take a look at the highlights. Under these new rules, companies will be permitted to make their employees work for 4 days instead of 5. In case companies opt for a 4-day week instead of 5, employees will need to work for 12 hours a day instead of 8 so that the total working hours do not get impacted. The basic salary of the employees will have to be 50% of the gross salary. The PF contributions of the employees and the employer will increase and the take-home salary will come down. The new rules recognize work-from-home structure which came into practice amid the COVID-19 pandemic. So what are these labour codes? Well, the government has notified 4 labour codes, namely the Code on Wages 2019, the Industrial Relations Code 2020, the Code on Social Security 2020 and the Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code 2020 by simplifying, amalgamating and rationalizing the relevant provisions of 29 central labour laws. There are more than 50 crore workers in the organised and unorganised sector in the country. A majority of these workers, that is around 90%, are in the unorganised sector. The government, through this amended labour law, has aimed to ensure the employees' welfare and their social security. Once implemented, the new labour codes are expected to revamp the rules dictating the age-old relationship between employees and their employers. And for deeper insights, I'm joined by an illustrious panel of guests. Joining us in the studio, Dr. Patra, MP, Rajya Sabha. He represents the BJD. Also in the studio, we have with us Mr. Binay Sinha, All India General Secretary, Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh. And joining us through virtual platform, Mr. Sanjay Aggarwal, Chairman, Paramount Groups. Also in the studio, we have with us young and vibrant audience. We also have workers with us in the panel. I welcome all of you on Sansad TV and thank you so much for joining us. All right, Dr. Patra, let me begin the program with you. I remember you were chairing the proceedings when this bill was passed in the upper house. Now, most of these laws that the government has simplified, rationalized or amalgamated trace their origin to British Raj. When we're talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, it was said that these codes or these changes were of paramount importance. In that context, take me through the importance of these codes.
You see, we had 29 laws and most of them actually come back from the pre-independence era. Looking at the need for reforms and looking at the need for expediting the process of development of the nation, it was extremely crucial that we would be able to rationalize, moderate and make these 29 laws more contemporary so that they are more contextual, they are more relevant to the process of the development of the nation. Subsuming these 29 laws, we had these 4 codes and all these 4 codes have specific functions. Now, the primary area, as you've already mentioned, Kriti ji, is, let's start with the idea of the definition of a worker. Now, usually the idea of the definition of a worker used to be a blue-collar job. But now, with this new codes coming in, you also have a very clear definition that it's not only inclined to blue-collared, it also includes white-collared. The second aspect is that the organized and the unorganized sector both come within the ambit of it. Labor laws were always seen as the Factories Act and the definition around, but that has changed with these laws, making it more vibrant, making it more far-reaching. The second area, if we were to look at, is in terms of social security. Usually the wages used to be low, the annual bonuses used to be high, because of which the Provident Fund being given on the basic wages, the Provident Fund used to be low and therefore reducing social security. Yeah. So now with a minimum 50% wage bracket, you are ensuring that the Provident Fund contribution increases. The third area, as you've already mentioned, is in terms of the work-life balance. If you were to look at the work-life balance, usually you find people used to work for 6 days a week. But people with new lifestyles, and especially with the gig economy coming in, people want quieter lifestyles and more space for themselves. So the reason was, should someone work for 8 hours a day for 6 days? Or should someone work for 4 hours a day for 12 hours? And complete the quota of 48 hours. I think thereby it adds flexibility, it reduces the overhead cost. It also helps the companies and industries to hire more temporal people towards the end of the weekend, and also provides the workforce greater opportunities for self-development.
So you mentioned a very important term, gig workers. सिन्हा जी, आपसे समझना चाहूँगी गिग वर्कर्स और सबसे बड़ी समस्या रही है जो अनऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर में जो वर्कर्स हैं उनके हितों का हनन जो लगातार होता रहा है। लगातार ये बात कही जा रही है कि लाइवलीहुड उनकी, चाहे वो सिक्योरिटी हो, चाहे वो वर्किंग कंडीशन हो, उस पर बहुत सारे सवाल उठे हैं। जब ये लेबर कोड्स इंप्लीमेंट होंगे, आपको क्या लगता है उस पर कितना असर होगा, खासकर अगर हम अनऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर और गिग वर्कर्स की बात करें तो?
देखिए मैडम, अभी तक पिछले 75 वर्षों में जितनी भी सरकारें आई, हमने सभी दलों की सरकारों को देखा है। ये सभी दलों की सरकारों ने जो भी लेबर लॉज बनाई वो ओनली 7 to 8% जो ऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर के वर्कर्स हैं उनके लिए ही बनाई, और आज तक वही अब तक चलता रहा। अनलकली ट्रेड यूनियन भी उतने ही तक अपने को कन्फाइंड रखे ऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर के वेलफेयर को लेकर के। लेकिन ये फॉर द फर्स्ट टाइम किसी सरकार ने ये 93% जो अनऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर वर्कर्स हैं इनके लिए ध्यान दिया, इनके लिए रूल्स बनाया। ये जो 4 लेबर कोड्स हैं इसमें कई ऐसे अच्छे प्रावधान हैं जिनसे अनऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर के लोगों को काफ़ी लाभ होगा। वेज कोड, खास करके जो वेज कोड है, ये वेज कोड फंटास्टिक है, हिस्टोरिक डिसीजन है कि आज अभी हम जो शेड्यूल एम्प्लॉयमेंट के जो एम्प्लॉय होते थे उनको ही हम मिनिमम वेज दिला पाते थे। लेकिन आज ये अगर ये वेज कोड इम्प्लीमेंट होता है जिस तरह से ये वेज कोड पार्लियामेंट में आया है, तो 93% के पूरे लास्ट ये के वर्कर्स को भी ये मिनिमम वेज पाने का अधिकार होगा जी। और ये पूरे कंट्री में समान होगा। आज अगर आप देखेंगे तो किसी स्टेट का कम है, किसी स्टेट का ज़्यादा है, काफ़ी डिफरेंस है। लेकिन अगर ये फ्लोर वेज से ज़्यादा कोई स्टेट दे सकता है, उससे कम नहीं दे सकता।
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल जी।
तो उसका है कि उनके लाइवलीहुड पर, उनके ये पर काफ़ी अच्छा इफेक्ट आएगा। सोशल सिक्योरिटी कोड जो आया है, सोशल सिक्योरिटी कोड में भी बहुत सारे ऐसे प्रावधान आए हैं जो अभी तक ये 7% जो बता रहे हैं ऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर को ही पीएफ हो या ईएसआई का स्कीम हो, पेंशन का स्कीम हो, लेकिन अभी इस कोड के इम्प्लीमेंटेशन होने में से हमारा ये अनऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर सबसे ज़्यादा बेनिफिशियल।
बिल्कुल सिन्हा जी, तो ये हो गई वर्कर्स की बात, एम्प्लॉयर्स की बात। अब समझते हैं एम्प्लॉयज़ की क्या एक्सपेक्टेशंस हैं और उनका क्या पर्सपेक्टिव है। ऑलराइट मिस्टर अग्रवाल, कमिंग टू यू नाउ। Indian companies may face a roadblock in implementing a 4-day work week under the present structure, as they may have to pay employees overtime for the additional work hours. That's what the experts are pointing out. The companies registered under the Factories Act cannot make one employee work for more than 9 hours on any day and 48 hours on any week. What is industry's perspective on this?
You see, these are certain ponderables, I would say, that we need to sort out when we, I think, firstly, I must welcome, it's a huge, huge exercise that has happened of 29 labor laws and codes being subsumed into just 4 codes. And that by itself is something that industry should always welcome, that this is a very positive step towards decreasing the confusion that used to exist on so many fronts. Having said that, there are still, one would say that there are a certain number of issues in the current labor codes in the way they are drafted. If implemented, they could have various difficulties, and this is the first one that you just pointed out regarding the anomaly of 9 hours in a day versus 12 hours in a day, how to sort that out. But there are other practical issues also that one has to consider, and the cost to the economy, cost to the industry, and cost to the worker. I think Patra Sahab has very rightly said that the social security in a way gets diluted for the worker if the basic salary is lower, and therefore the contributions which go into Provident Fund, for example, or even for ESI get proportionately reduced. But at the same time, whenever we have to implement this scheme, there is a concern that the take-home salary for the employee
Yes,
could
sir.
go down by as much as 4 to 5%, maybe even more in many cases. And that is something that could disturb the domestic budgets of the employees, the workers.
Absolutely, sir. That's a very
That
valid point that you're making, Mr. Aggarwal. We'll get clarity on that. But before that, let's also take some questions from our audience here. Please go ahead. Introduce yourself and speak your mind.
Last time when this bill was introduced and implementation through Lok Sabha, many of trade unions, many of labor organization union, they targeted, and there is loopholes and.
All right. So basically, you're trying to ask
Yes,
that many trade unions said that there are several loopholes in these codes.
None of the changes in the world will satisfy each and every person of the society. So we should have the mindset to accept the changes. So most of the trade union affiliated to the political parties, so they have their political compulsions. Whatsoever this government or that government will do, opposition will react.
All right. So sir is saying that change is the only constant.
Yeah.
Let's take another question now.
ये बोला जा रहा है कि सरकार 100 से 300 लोगों को फायर कर सकती है कंपनी बिफोर, मतलब कि गवर्नमेंट को नोटिस दिए बिना, बट इससे इंक्रीज हायरिंग और मीन्स फायरिंग ज़्यादा हो जाएगा. अगर लोग हड़ताल भी करना चाहे तो 14 दिन पहले आपको नोटिस करने पड़ेंगे.
Dr. Patra, that's a very valid concern that the young lady is raising.
The point being made is because, you're going to have a requirement for about 300 workers. If a company has 300 workers, and any company within the realm of 300 workers can go for retrenchment and layoffs. In fact, this code goes a step further. In fact, it's just the reverse. Earlier, the rules were that if a company has 100 workers or less, he or she, that company, could go for retrenchment, layoff, hire and fire without permission. Now that anvil has been increased to 300 workers. So in fact, greater security is being provided to companies or to the workers of the companies, that let's say I had a company, I had 100 workers. Now with 100 workers, I could take any call on them without seeking permission. But now that scale has been increased to 300. So in fact, just the reverse has happened. If they had reduced it from 100 to 50, we could have said, yes, now it gives a greater liability to these companies to decide how they want to do it. But by increasing the margin from 100 workers, now a company with 300 workers at that extent can go for it. I think that creates a greater social security.
All right, let's take another question now.
बहुत सारे चेंजेस आए इस कोड में. तो सर बहुत से वर्कर्स का और ट्रेड यूनियन का भी कहना है कि पहले से ही उन पे एक्सप्लॉयटेशन होता आ रहा है, और इस चेंजेस के बाद भी उन पे बहुत सारे एक्सप्लॉयटेशन आए क्योंकि सारे पावर कंपनीज़ के एम्प्लॉयज़ के पास है. और जैसे कि रिसेंटली हम लोग न्यूज़ देख सकते हैं कि बायजूस 2500 वर्कर्स को फायर कर दिया बिना किसी रीज़न, प्रॉपर रीज़न के. तो सर जो वर्कर्स हैं वो खुद को फील कैसे, हाउ दोस पीपल विल फील सेफ?
Mr. Sanjay Aggarwal, that's the question that Mr. Mishra is raising here in our studio, that this is lopsided and it favors the companies instead of the workers. Your response?
You see, my response is that everything must favor the nation. There is nothing called favoring the workers or the company, because company and worker together have to do well. Only if the company is doing well will the worker do well, and only if the worker is satisfied will the company be able to do well. So the practical issues that are there, they will always be subject to debate, and which of course is a healthy thing to happen. But at the same time, the anomalies, as we say, should be addressed. In a way, I think this is a positive step. The PSD chamber, of which I was the president till last year, has also been welcoming of the codes. But of course, the anomalies, the difficulties have to be addressed. And for example, the steep change in the gratuity bill that is going to come, that is going to be huge. And I'll again repeat that the take-home salary of the workers going down because of the basic salary being increased to 50% of gross is a serious issue that needs to be considered.
All right, Dr. Patra, look at that. Mr. Sanjay Aggarwal says that take-home salary is going to come down. He has concerns about gratuity. We also have concerns about the implementation because Labour is on the concurrent list where states and the centre, they have to be on board together. What are the other concerns and how do we address these concerns?
You see, the first concern regarding reduced salary, whenever you have a higher wage bracket, obviously the Provident Fund payouts and the gratuity payouts increase. Now, the other thing is we have a 30 to 35% bracket for wage, and we provide other additional bonuses and thereby reduce Provident Fund. In our nation, as we know, the savings rate of our nation is comparatively lower than many of the other developing nations and developed nations. The question is, someone probably gets more money in the hand of the end of the month, but after retirement, the person is left with very little. Do we want that kind of a thing in our nation? Or should we have greater compulsory savings through Provident Fund and gratuity and ensure that this person, when he retires, he has a greater social security? That's a trade-off that we have to do. I think this code, what it's trying to do is, by increasing the scope of the wage bill and increasing the need for greater Provident Fund, it surely is going to dent the wage. That's given. Because whenever a Provident Fund increase happens, because of a wage increase, it will dent the salary and the salaries will come down in hand. But what it does is it provides greater social security. But then as a nation, we should also understand, do we want greater savings compulsorily done? Because a person, a middle class person, even a worker, does not have that luxury of disposable income. So that's a trade-off. The second aspect that you mentioned about is there are different states that have not yet provided those draft rules. So there are about 23 states and union territories that have done that. So what happens that if they delay it, the implementation is reduced. So I believe right now, the government of India should start this entire exercise of reaching out to those states and union territories and trying to galvanize them on a common platform and say, if you have concerns, what are those concerns? We haven't seen, at least I haven't seen a single national platform since 2020 now, where all the state ministers have been called in who are taking care of labor, along with the union ministry, deliberating, discussing, debating that what are the draft rules that you have done, what are the changes that you're going, what are your timelines that you're going to do, and by when you want to implement it.
All right, so we'll have to wait and see how that shapes up. But before we take more questions from our audience, सिन्हा जी आपसे समझना चाहूँगी, वर्क फ्रॉम होम को रिकग्निशन मिला है, ये वर्कर्स के लिए कितनी बड़ी चीज़ है?
ये वर्क फ्रॉम होम्स का जो वर्कर्स प्रोस्पेक्टिव से अगर हम देखें तो वो ठीक नहीं है।
अच्छा,
इसलिए ठीक नहीं है कि वो एस्टेब्लिशमेंट के डिफिनेशन में नहीं आएगा, और एस्टेब्लिशमेंट के डिफिनेशन में नहीं आएगा तो कोई भी लेबर लॉज उस पर नहीं लगेगा। फर्स्ट थिंग। सेकंड थिंग कि जब हम वर्क फ्रॉम होम करते हैं तो हमारा फैमिली ये डिस्टर्ब होता है, हमारा हेल्थ डिस्टर्ब होता है, इसलिए ये किसी भी तरह से ये उचित नहीं है।
All right, so there's a divergent view there on work from home, but also let's take more questions now.
If labor wants to strike against them, the organization and a company, so they'll have to update before 14 days. After the 14 days, if deal is not done, so they will not file the complaint in district court. So they will have to go from the the high court.
Right.
The problem is that कि गवर्नमेंट का ऑर्गेनाइजेशन के बीच का जो कम्युनिकेशन गैप है वो बहुत ज़्यादा है। उन लोगों को वो लोग वहाँ तक नहीं पहुँच सकते। सुविधा तो सब चीज़ की है मगर उनको मिलना बहुत ज़्यादा मुश्किल हो जाता है।
So what about the legal rights?
पहले था कि जो कंपलसरी सर्विसेज है, एसेंशियल सर्विसेज है, उसके लिए ही हमको 14 दिन की नोटिस देना होता था। अभी जो नया प्रावधान हो रहा है कि किसी में भी हमको 14 दिन का नोटिस देना होगा स्ट्राइक के लिए। इन केस अगर रिकॉन्सिलेशन में कॉन्सिलेशन प्रोसीडिंग में जाता है तो तब तक हम स्ट्राइक नहीं कर सकते हैं जब तक कि कॉन्सिलेशन पेंडिंग है। ये हमको एक हमारे अगेंस्ट है, ये इसको हम सपोर्ट नहीं करते। लेकिन इसके साथ साथ इस कोड में भी आपको राइट है कि ये वर्कर जो है, पहले हम वेज के लिए हम क्लेम कर पाते थे विद इन 1 ईयर, अभी हम विद इन 3 ईयर्स हम वेज को क्लेम कर सकते हैं। पहले क्या था कि इस वेज को सेटल करने के लिए हमको लेबर डिपार्टमेंट के इंस्पेक्टर पर डिपेंड करना पड़ता था, लेकिन अभी हम डायरेक्ट वर्कर और ट्रेड यूनियन जो है सो कोर्ट में हम मूव कर सकते हैं।
At present, for registration of trade union, there is a minimum requirement of 7 members there. In coming proposed law, there is a minimum requirement of 110% of total employment. At that time, how the union will survive or union will get the registration?
I believe what we have seen, and Sir can probably address it much better, is what we have seen, there has been the idea of trade unionism that started in the 50s, 60s and gained currency in the 70s and the 80s was primarily to galvanize the workers' participation in management, which is called as collective bargaining, where a trade union and a management sits together and becomes a point of force of negotiation. But what we have seen, and this probably the law has been made to take care of that, is because 7 employees or 7 workers can form a trade union, many organizations had 5, 10, 15, 20 trade unions. So the question is, management has to start dealing with a registered trade union as per rule. Now, registered trade union, if there are 15, then each person, can all of them come onto a consensus? So therefore, what happens, there becomes a diversity of interest. And sir has already mentioned about the interest. I'm not going to the political side of it. So what happens when you have large number of people talking heads and large number of people having an equal voice? Every worker should have an equal voice.
Absolutely,
I completely agree. But at the same point of time, we have to ensure that the proliferation of trade unions, is it good for the industry? Or should there be fewer trade unions, but more stronger trade unions?
Will this law be affecting the employment structure? Like, for example, if I take example of factory, people working in factory are working in slots, like 8 hours a day, that means 3 slots in a day. And now 12 hours will affect that slots, slots will be like 2 slots in a day. That means employment will be reduced.
We have to understand the dynamics of the hour per day versus hour per week. When you look at hour per day and you say, okay, instead of 8 hours, if we are going to work 12 hours, then we are going to eat into the employment of someone somewhere. That's your fair point. But the capping of the total number of hours of working in a week is 48 hours. Now, let's say, for example, I am a person, I work for 6 days a week, I work for 8 hours a week, I do 48 hours, correct? Now, instead of that, if I'm working 12 hours a day, I work for 4 days, so there's a balance 2 days in which I'm not working. So someone else is surely working in my place because the production will not stop. So therefore, the idea is to allow flexibility to organizations and employees that do you want 3 days off in a week or do you not 1 day off?
1 day.
Now you can say, okay, I want to work for 4 days, I'll enjoy the rest 3 days. It's fine. Otherwise, he could take up another profession, another vocation, can do something else. The second is for the companies also. Workforce management and workforce planning becomes easier.
All right, Mr. Aggarwal, I'll give you the last word on the show. Several countries such as Spain, Japan, New Zealand, Ireland, Scotland and Iceland have a 4-day work week on an experimental basis. But they also have reduced number of weekly working hours. What kind of example do we have from these countries for our country?
I think we should avoid following that example because we are at a different stage of economic development compared to these countries. And if you look at all the tiger economies, starting from the Southeast Asian nations right up to China, they have basically become more competitive and they have industrialized and they have become the suppliers to the whole world on the strength of their labor force, on the strength of their being able to produce goods cheaply. Now, if every time there is a trade-off, the economy, ultimately China is the biggest beneficiary. After being a cheap producer of goods, it has become the largest economy and its public, its workers, everybody has benefited. If we put on too much of restrictions on the industry and make it uncompetitive, then I think we are going to put ourselves into an economic decline, which is not at all recommended at this stage of our economic development. We have to be very, very fair to the workers, fair to the employees, but at the same time, we should not go the way these Western economies have gone, where manufacturing has become totally unviable, let me say. I myself owned a company, manufacturing company in UK, and I know the sort of working hours that people maintain and why that company became totally unviable to manufacture. So I think we should not follow that route. Our nation needs to be the factory to the world. We have to export, and that's what the Prime Minister of India says.
Right.
We have to become the powerhouse for manufacturing and export product.
And absolutely, there has to be a fine balance between ensuring ease of doing business as well as upholding the rights of the workers. On that note, I'm completely out of time on the show. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Patra, Mr. Sinha and Mr. Aggarwal. Next week, we'll return with incisive analysis of another important bill. Till then, take care and stay tuned to Sansad TV. Namaskar.